At 22, I had finally begun carving out a life of my own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My modest studio apartment in Denver, Colorado, felt like a symbol of hard-earned independence. I had a stable job as a graphic designer at a local firm and was taking online courses to sharpen my skills. Life was far from perfect, but considering how my world had unraveled just a year before, I was proud of how far I had come. It all began on an overcast afternoon, the kind where the sky hung low and gray, as if mirroring the weight in my chest. My father called me into the living room of the house I had grown up in, his arms folded across his chest, his face devoid of emotion. There was no preamble, no softening of the blow. Just a simple, cutting statement. You need to move out. Your stepbrother is moving in. We need the space. You're old enough to handle yourself now. I stood there, stunned, searching his face for some trace of empathy, some flicker of guilt. There was none. Derek, my stepbrother, had always been the golden child. At 20, he was reckless, entitled, and infuriatingly immune to consequences. He had never lifted a finger to help around the house, never taken responsibility for anything, yet my father treated him as if he could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I had spent years shouldering responsibilities without complaint, only to be cast aside the moment it suited them. The days that followed were a blur of anger and desperation. I scrambled to find a place to stay with my meager savings, eventually securing a tiny apartment in a less-than-ideal part of the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I threw myself into my work, into my studies, determined not to let their betrayal define me. I told myself I was free of them, that I would never let them hurt me again. Months passed. The resentment never fully faded, but I buried it beneath a determination to move forward. Then, 2 weeks ago, my father reached out. The sound of his voice brought back a flood of emotions, but there was no apology, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Just a nervous request for help. Derek had gotten himself into serious trouble. He had been caught stealing high-end electronics from a neighbor's garage. The evidence against him was overwhelming: security footage, fingerprints, even text messages outlining the theft. My father explained all of this to me, and then, with the same audacity that had always defined him, he made his request. "Take the blame," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Just say you borrowed them and made a mistake. We'll hire a lawyer to get you off with a minor penalty. Derek's future is at stake. He can't have a criminal record." His tone was firm, expectant, as if it was my duty to sacrifice myself for Derek yet again. As if I owed them something. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Instead of hanging up, I told him I'd think about it. Inside, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. For years, I had quietly saved texts, emails, even recordings, proof of the gaslighting, the favoritism, the endless ways they had tried to manipulate me. Now, for the first time, I had a chance to use it. I reached out to a lawyer I had met back in college. He had been a regular at the coffee shop where I worked, always friendly, always offering bits of legal advice. When I explained the situation, he agreed to help. "Play along," he advised. "Gather as much evidence as you can. If they're coercing you to commit perjury, you need solid proof." A week before the trial, I arranged to meet my father and Derek at a diner just outside the city. My father was tense, but Derek strolled in wearing designer clothes, sipping an overpriced coffee he had brought along. The contrast between their attitudes and the gravity of the situation was almost laughable. I kept my phone in my jacket pocket, the recording app running. I played my role perfectly, feigning uncertainty, pretending to be swayed by their arguments. I nodded along, mumbling my agreement, carefully steering the conversation to get them to incriminate themselves. Derek, in his arrogance, made it easy. He bragged about how he had hidden the stolen items in his old bedroom closet, how no one would ever suspect him. My father, ever the enabler, assured me that they would take care of me once this was all over. Every word was captured. As the trial date approached, their lawyer reached out, coaching me on my testimony. He instructed me to keep my story simple, to avoid implicating Derek. I played along, asking just enough questions to hint at my reluctance, adding more to my growing pile of evidence. On the day of the trial, I walked into the courtroom feeling a strange mix of nerves and exhilaration. I took my seat, my heart pounding as the proceedings began. When I was called to the stand, I could feel my father's gaze burning into me, could sense Derek's smug confidence. And then, with the entire courtroom watching, I pressed play. The recording filled the air, each damning word clear as day. My father's coercion. Derek's confession. Their lawyer's coaching. Gasps rippled through the room. My father's face drained of color. Derek's jaw slackened in horror. The judge's eyes narrowed. In that moment, the power shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being sacrificed. They had expected me to be their scapegoat. Instead, I became their downfall. My father and Derek sat at the defense table, their expressions smug, exuding the confidence of men who believed they had already won. Their lawyer greeted me with a knowing smile, as if we were all conspirators in some carefully orchestrated deception. He had no idea I had a plan of my own. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath, my pulse steady despite the weight of the moment. I stepped onto the stand, feeling the eyes of the entire courtroom on me. The prosecutor's first question was simple. Do you admit to taking the electronics? I let the silence stretch just long enough to build anticipation, then glanced at my father and Derek. They sat motionless, watching me intently, expecting me to fall in line like I always had. Instead, I met the prosecutor's gaze and said, "Actually, I have a confession. I didn't take anything, but I do know who did." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom, gasps and whispers filling the air. My father's face turned ashen, and Derek looked as if I had physically struck him. The judge quickly called for order, and I continued, my voice unwavering. I detailed how my father and Derek had approached me, how they had asked me to lie, to throw away my future to protect Derek's. I recounted their promises of money, their assurances that it would all work out in the end, as long as I took the fall. Then, the prosecutor presented the recording. As the audio played, the courtroom was thick with stunned silence. My father's voice, cold and instructive, echoed through the speakers, guiding me on how to commit perjury. Derek's arrogance oozed from every word as he boasted about hiding the stolen electronics in his old bedroom closet, certain that no one would ever catch him. The atmosphere shifted. The jury members exchanged appalled glances. The judge's expression darkened with each passing second. Their lawyer scrambled, rising to his feet with a desperate objection, claiming the recording was inadmissible. But the prosecutor calmly countered, citing the legality of one-party consent recordings in this jurisdiction. The judge allowed the evidence to stand. From that moment, the defense's case crumbled. The prosecutor introduced even more damning evidence. The stolen items had been found exactly where Derek had so confidently hidden them. My lawyer friend, the one who had guided me through this ordeal, testified about the coaching attempts made by their legal team, further solidifying my claims. The defense tried to discredit me, but their arguments were weak, bordering on pathetic. The more they grasped at straws, the more desperate they appeared. By the time the final arguments were made, there was no question who was guilty. The verdict was swift. Derek was convicted of theft, and additional charges were brought against both him and my father for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The judge's final words to them were laced with quiet fury. You attempted to manipulate this court and exploit a family member for your own gain. The law does not tolerate such behavior, and neither will this court. The consequences of their actions unraveled quickly. Arrest warrants were issued. My father and Derek, who had been so sure they could twist the truth in their favor, now faced the full weight of the justice system. In trying to protect Derek's reputation, they had instead destroyed their own. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. The grip they had once held over me was gone. No more manipulation, no more forced sacrifices. I had taken a risk that could have backfired spectacularly, but instead, I had exposed the truth and ensured that justice prevailed. Life didn't change overnight. I still lived in my small studio apartment, still worked long hours, still juggled my studies with my job. But something inside me had shifted. I carried myself with a new confidence, a resilience that had been forged through betrayal and defiance. I had stood up for myself, and that alone was enough. News of the trial spread quickly. Some relatives reached out with quiet words of support. Others remained silent, unwilling to acknowledge the truth. It didn't matter. I no longer sought their validation. I had spent years believing that family meant loyalty at all costs, even at the expense of my own well-being. But now I understood, Family should never demand your silence in the face of injustice. As I sat in my apartment that evening, staring out at the city lights, I realized how far I had come. Once, I had been cast aside, treated as disposable, asked to sacrifice everything for people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. But I had turned their scheme on its head. I had fought back. And I had won. To anyone reading this, let my story serve as a reminder. You do not have to accept manipulation, even from those who claim to love you. Stand your ground. Know your worth. And when the time comes, do not be afraid to fight for the truth. Justice may not always be easy. It may not always be kind. But it is always, always worth it.